Trina Chaisson, I'm so excited to have you on my webinar here. I can't wait to hear what you've been up to. And before we get into it, I just want to set the stage that I really probably would not have paid any attention to the insect sector had it not been for Trina and her patient explanation of all the science behind it, but also all the market opportunities for these wonderful micro livestock insects or animals. So Trina, I'm going to basically turn this over to you and ask you just a few questions and let you talk. I've seen you on stage and I know you're a dynamic speaker and you move audiences, but when you were in Maine, how did you first get involved with insects? What was it about bugs that fascinated you?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Andrew. I'm always excited to talk about bugs. So I'm thrilled to be on here and chatting about the thing that I love most. Way back in Maine, wow, I grew up in a log cabin in the woods of Maine, and from very, I was very interested in
Hey
environment.
Trina, your fancy headphones are cutting in and out there.
Ooh, okay.
You might want to put the ones that have a wire on, and we will cut this part out for our first blooper for the blooper reel as well. So appreciate Trina jumping on that one.
Hold on. Let's see here. I wonder if I can use these ones again.
I hear you clearly right now.
You do?
Oh
Okay.
yeah.
All right, we'll just go.
Unless you're building a house in the background or something.
All right, sounds good.
Anyway, so you were there in Maine in a log cabin, and that's about where it cut out.
Yeah. So I grew up in a log cabin in the woods of Maine, and from a very young age, I was always very interested in the environment, being in the middle of the woods, seeing the diversity of wildlife around. I just really cared. And when I was very young, I found a book on my parents' bookshelf called Diet for a Small Planet. It was one of the first books in the 70s that really made the case that different foods that you eat require different amounts of resources. If you eat a pound of beef, it requires all of the corn and soy or pasture that goes to feed the cow. And here's the amount of land, water, etc., other resources that you need for various food types. And that was a very convincing argument for me. I decided to do what no one else did in my area. I became a vegetarian at a very young age, which I never stopped doing that. So I've always been very interested in alternative proteins. Insects came across my radar, I want to say about 10 or 12 years ago, and I just followed it as a side interest. It just fascinated me from a first principles perspective. The idea that insects have evolved to consume a whole range of byproducts and waste streams and convert those into high density proteins, and then we could use that all across our agricultural supply chain. It just made sense to me. So I've been fascinated by it for a long time. And then about 5 years ago, the opportunity came along to start something new. Previously, I had built a startup that was a web application for data visualization and analysis that I sold after 3 years to Tableau software. And I worked for Tableau for about 1.5 years, but then was getting the itch to start something new again, and insects were the top of my mind. So I left Tableau and started doing research. I actually moved to New York City for a few months. I was in San Francisco at the time, wanted to kind of get a fresh headspace to explore this new idea and really think about, is this an idea worth pursuing? And if it is, why isn't it already being done at scale? What's the issue here? So after about 3 months of reading academic literature and making phone calls and doing tons of research, I kind of came to the conclusion that there was a huge opportunity for insect protein, but it was kind of a chicken and egg problem. It was really difficult for existing very large agricultural producers to get into the game of growing insects as protein because there wasn't really a huge market for it. And there wouldn't really be a market for it until there was a supply for it. And it was very expensive to grow these things because no one had put in the R&D to figure out how to grow them at scale. So I thought, well, maybe I can figure this out. And I teamed up with an entomologist and a hardware engineer. We went through Y Combinator. We started growing bugs out of shipping containers in San Francisco. After about 1 year, the opportunity came along to purchase a 35-year-old insect farm in LaBelle, Florida, of all places. So we packed up our bags and we moved from San Francisco to Florida, and we've been there ever since. And then more recently, about 8 months ago, we took over our second farm in Canton, Mississippi, also a very old insect farm, about 30 years old. So yeah, now we have 2 locations and we grow bugs.
That is so neat. Now, I understand that recently you were brushing up on your French. You were in Canada, in Quebec. Is that correct? What was going on up there?
Yeah, I just got back on Saturday from the Insects to Feed the World conference in Quebec City. And actually, when I was doing my first startup, I was back and forth. I did it from Chicago and Montreal. So Montreal is kind of my old stomping ground. So when I went back, I was really excited to hit up my old favorite poutine places. But we drove from Montreal to Quebec City. I went with my co-founder Tequila and our research manager, Chris Edwards. And it was a 4-day conference of insect ag folks. And I gotta say, the last time I went to one of these events was in 2019 in Georgia. And we had maybe 30 people at this event. And at the event in Quebec City, I'd say there's easily 10 times that. So it's been pretty cool to see how much the industry has evolved in such a short time. And actually, there's a really cool, interesting stat that came out of one of the talks. Out of all the papers that have been written about insect agriculture, 80% of those have come out in the last 5 years. So what we are learning in this field is accelerating. There's more funding and more interest going into this space. And it's just so cool to see the diversity of thought. This conference in particular was mostly geared toward academics. So there was a lot of just really interesting cutting edge research that was coming out.
Well, anything you can share with us? And back to the white paper piece, when you first introduced me to insects, I think the initial white paper I read, and it may have been 2016, was on the humane euthanization of insects so we can avoid any of the headaches that the animal ag industries encountered around that. And I think that's fantastic. And we just had our conversation with Future Fields. Their fruit flies are so happy they can open up their enclosures and they stay in there because they have everything they need inside those enclosures. I think that's a testament to their welfare as well. So congratulations to the insect industry thinking through these issues before they pop up. But back to the questions. So anything you can share coming out of Quebec that might be newsworthy here in our Rosie's podcast?
Oh goodness, so much. There's a lot of research on black soldier fly and mealworms, and a lot of, actually more than we expected, some research on Xephobus morio, which is one of the species that we're passionate about that we rear, common name superworm. A lot of interesting research on crickets. I don't know that there's anything specific that's coming to mind as noteworthy, but actually on your point about the humane rearing of insects, when you said that the Future Fields guys said their flies just want to stay in their habitats, I can relate to that. I mean, that's one of the interesting things about growing insects is that, with other livestock, if you cram them too close together, they tend to get really stressed out. But with insects, if you put a bunch of them in a room, you'll find them all clustered in the corner, right in this one little spot together, because they have aggregation pheromones. They love being in small, dark, compact environments. And we have open bins for our insects. So, our crickets can get out if they want. They don't want to. They have their food, they have their water. In fact, all kinds of other insects want in on the party. It's a problem. It's a nice spot for them. It really is.
That's wonderful to hear it. And I do want to talk more about crickets, obviously. But before we get to that, there is one thing that I know you're passionate about, and that's spreading the joy of insects to the community. And there's a nonprofit or an organization that you're involved in, and I tend to butcher the name of it is Entomophotron. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, Entomophotron. So when I first got started on this project, I had a friend that worked for an organization called Guerrilla Science. And Guerrilla Science is a nonprofit that uses interactive art and immersive theater as a vehicle for science education. It's pretty brilliant, actually. So they basically create these really elaborate art projects that are science education projects in disguise, and then they bring them to festivals and basically win over people's hearts and minds with the joy of science. And so I pitched a project to them called the Entomophotron, And that was actually part of what I was doing in New York when I went there for the 3 months. I had studio space at Pratt Institute and some materials budget. And we created an edible insect diner and experience station. It's like this 1950s style diner, checker floors, hot pink sparkly stools, bright lime green and teal bar kind of setup. We have these pink polka dot dresses with white frilly aprons. It's silly. And then we have these menus, and people look at the menus and they'll choose an experience. But we've taken this to about 7 or 8 different festivals. It's been to a festival in Oregon. It's been to a few county fairs in New York. It's been to Burning Man. It's been to a number of different places. And we tried to actually adjust the experience a little bit based on the audience and who's showing up. And so, for example, someone might show up and they look just kind of a little bit, ooh, I don't know about this, right? And we'll kind of immediately shift our strategy and we'll say, can we suggest to you one of these? Maybe you would like to try your real worm, or maybe you would like to try a fake one. And we'll hold up a jar of dried mealworms and a jar of gummy worms, right? And they invariably are like, oh, I'll take the gummy worm. And we're like, okay, what's scary about these, right? Or what's scary about this one? And they're like, oh, I just don't know what's in it. And we're like, you know what's in this one? They say, no, not at all. So it results in a lot of really fun conversations. And it's just really fun to kind of, no matter where they are, whether they're come up to the bar and they say, I want to try every bug that you have, every single one, give it to me. I will eat all of your bugs, versus
And are they saying that sober, or they have alcoholic too?
Yeah, they do. And you get a lot of really interesting interactions where you'll get families that come up, and sometimes the kids are really into eating the bugs and the parents are not. And then we'll have this conversation about entomology and the presence of insects in our food systems, and they'll kind of change their minds. Or sometimes they don't want to eat bugs at all. And we had a live cockroach race that was really fun. You just narrate with a hot pink megaphone as these roaches go on their path. We actually had professional actors and comedians in addition to entomologists manning the booth. So it was a pretty interesting mix of different ideas and concepts that we got to talk about in the context of this. And actually, more recently, there was an academic paper published on the Entomophotron and some of the other art that guerrilla science supports. And it really dove into how this type of art is really effective at changing people's perspectives. And I'd say that was one of the most rewarding parts of the art. When you saw someone that came up to the booth and they were just really totally disgusted and not interested at all. And then we had a conversation about, okay, there's this number of insect parts per million in your food. And you could either use a lot more pesticide or throw out a lot more food, or you could accept that there are insects in your food and it doesn't actually harm you, and it's probably better for the environment, better for our pocketbooks. And it was really great to see their minds change in real time through this art.
Well, and you actually changed my mind early on, and you made a great comment that we're a first world country and we don't want visible insect protein in our food. We will take invisible or powders or emulsifications or flours or things like that. But in second, third world countries, it's a lot more commonplace. It's more of a societal mindset than it is, well, than anything else, obviously.
Definitely. Yeah, acceptance is absolutely cultural. Mm-hmm.
So speaking of acceptance, when you moved down to LaBelle, Florida, and you opened the doors and you saw all the potential there to raise insects, and you started with crickets, right? Can you talk about why crickets and how it all worked out and where the evolution happened with you?
Yeah, we did start with crickets. We started out with crickets when we were back in San Francisco for a couple of reasons. One, I was most interested in the human food side when I first got into this. I was interested in a climate-friendly, high-density protein that someone like me, a vegetarian that would like to have nutrient-dense, sustainable protein in her diet, would eat. So that was really interesting to me. And crickets have a very high protein content compared to a lot of other bugs. So that was very interesting to us as well. And in the industry, they call crickets the gateway bug. It's the friendliest bug that people are used to seeing. You already see cricket protein bars on Amazon, cricket powders on Amazon. So it was something that people felt a lot more comfortable with versus, say, black soldier fly larvae meal. Not quite as friendly of a consumer, from a consumer branding perspective, I'd say. So we started with crickets, and we grew those in San Francisco, and we moved to LaBelle, and we were growing crickets there as well. And then in 2019, a disaster hit our farm, and we contracted what's called Aceta domesticus densovirus. And it is a virus that only affects the species of cricket that we were growing. And it has a 95, 99% mortality rate. Basically, you can't recover from it. You're toast. So all of a sudden, millions of crickets died. We had no idea what was going on, no clue how to stop it. It was stressful. And we eventually figured it out that it was this virus, and we were able to switch species. But what saved us at that moment was being able to kind of quickly pivot to superworms, which was another species that we were rearing at the time. And once our focus kind of shifted to this other species, we actually started to look at it a lot more closely. And we said, actually, this species is really amazing. It doesn't have quite the protein content of crickets. It's a little bit lower, but they're will be a lot easier to rear at scale. They can consume a much more diverse diet. They grow very quickly compared to some of their cousins in that in the tenebrionid space. And we just really fell in love with them and thought it seemed like a much more scalable species. And since a little bit of our focus had shifted from the human food side to thinking more about pet food and livestock, other animal feeds, and other places where we could add a lot more insect protein, because I think in that time we also, didn't see the human food market growing as quickly as we would need it to grow for us to be a venture scale company. As we want to make an impact on the climate, right? We don't want to play small scale. So the superworm just seemed like a better fit for us moving forward. So today we still grow both species. We also sell.
Well, back to the superworm and their diet. I know you told me a fun fact too. You fill my head with all these great, interesting stories. You're like, Andrew, when they eat polystyrene and styrofoam, they poop out antifreeze. I'm like, what? That's the weirdest thing ever. Is that true?
Yeah.
I hear you correctly?
Yeah, no, it's true. They can digest polystyrene. There's been a lot of articles recently. There was a paper that came out, I want to say a few weeks ago, and since then, New York Times picked it up. I think Washington Post picked it up. A lot of major outlets picked up the story about superworms digesting polystyrene. Now, it's been known for a while that a lot of tenebrionids can digest polystyrene, but I think because superworms are bigger, they just do it much faster. And this paper was more focused on that species. It is very interesting.
And another thing, going back to, and again, another reason I'm fascinated with everything you say is you really got me onto the protein applications in the market. Early on, you as well as me, I assumed human consumption was the end goal for all insect rearing, and very quickly realized that there's multiple verticals. And it's not only the livestock for the aqua feed and the poultry feed and swine feed we're exploring. There's also the pet food industry. And you mentioned it to me, and I'm hearing it from the pet food side as well, that this is an area of great interest that they have. Can you talk a little bit about how your bugs fit into the pet food chain, both live and processed?
Yeah. So the majority of our insects today are actually sold into the exotic pet market. It's a market that's existed for 75 years in the United States, first selling into the fish bait market. And then in the 90s, when Jurassic Park came out and it became cool for 12-year-olds to have bearded dragons, a whole new market opened up. So now the market for exotic live insects in exotic pets is actually a lot bigger than most people realize in the States. So it's been a really good early market for us because the insects require no processing. The customers are already there. We can get a higher margin for our bugs on that product. But we are putting significant effort into creating a shelf-stable insect meal this year to be sold mostly into the pet food market. We can sell it into the human food market as well. But as we discussed, the market is a bit smaller on the human food side at the moment. But the pet food market is really, really interesting. And I'd say that's where a lot of focus is going in our industry today. All of the big players are now playing in insect-based dog food, Purina, Mars, Petco. There are a lot of folks out there that are working on this. There are some regulatory hurdles to get over to unlock it in the United States 100%, but everyone's there and consumers are there because it's, about 25% of animal meat in the United States goes into pet food. Most people find that number shocking. It's pretty large, right? And then people ask, well, isn't it all animal byproduct that's going into pet food? And the answer is no, actually it's not. There is a lot of byproduct going into pet food, but a lot of that byproduct is also what they call edible byproduct. It's things like chicken feet and pig feet and organ meat and meat that otherwise might go to other countries. You might not see it very often in grocery store shelves in the United States, but it would be eaten by people if it isn't getting sucked up by the pet food industry. So I think with how quickly demand is growing for meat across the globe, it's really important to have some alternative proteins that we can scale. Additionally, I just learned this recently, but a fairly significant number of dogs are allergic to chicken meat and other traditional animal meat. And so insects are now being promoted as a hypoallergenic protein source in pet food, which is pretty interesting.
Now, I mean, is it a one-for-one match with animal proteins and insect proteins? Are insect proteins even more beneficial than animal proteins? And how do they compare to the soy products that are out there that are also contain protein?
Yeah, that's a really complicated question. And the answer is that it depends. In terms of what you have to think about when you're thinking about protein is not just the crude protein percentage. You're not just thinking, okay, this is 60% protein and this is 60% protein, because protein is comprised of a number of different amino acids, right? And it's the amino acid composition that's required for the species you're feeding. So cats might need a different set of amino acids or amino acid composition than dogs versus humans versus cows, right? They all have different nutritional requirements. And then further, what makes this even more complicated is that you can have the same amino acids in animal meat or plant-based proteins, and yet it'll be differently digested. So the digestibility or bioavailability will be different between those two things. So animal proteins tend to be highly digestible and plant proteins often are not. Even though they're the same amino acid, the chemical structure is slightly different and it completely changes the way that you absorb that nutrient. And that's why you have animals like cats that are considered obligate carnivores, where you can't just feed them plant-based proteins and expect everything to be okay. So that's one of the big differences, is that for a lot of plant-based proteins, even though it looks like they have the same amount of protein, you're not actually digesting that amount, whereas insects are extremely nutritious and allow you to absorb those nutrients.
Sorry, the mute on there. Another question, this has always been a point of fascination to me, is the feeding of the insects themselves. Oftentimes it's the waste food streams and other streams that we're able to utilize for feedstock, and the type of feed these insects consume, I imagine, is going to express itself in their biochemistry into the proteins. And I know I dabbled my toe in, can we feed them algae and have the insects express an omega-3 in their protein? Can we feed them duckweed byproducts? Have you tried this? Are there trials that you've seen? What are your thoughts on enhancing the end result by optimizing the feed?
Right. Yeah, this is a huge opportunity in insect rearing more broadly. Insects are already excellent at feed conversion. They are cold-blooded, which means that they take their feed and instead of generating heat, they're generating biomass. So pound for pound, if you feed X amount of feed to a chicken or a pig and feed the same amount of feed to an insect, you're going to get a lot more insect out of that feed. They're already incredible at that. Then on top of that, they can consume a wide variety of waste materials. You already mentioned polystyrene, right? There are a number of other things that they can eat that might not be suitable feedstock for pigs or chickens or humans. Currently, we feed our superworms byproducts. We feed them byproducts of the flour milling process bran, and we also feed them a hydration source. We go to the local farmers market in Florida. They call it a farmers market, but it's really more of a produce redistribution center. And they always have pallets of vegetables that are just a little bit too junky for humans to eat, right? And they're going to head to the landfill. So we go and we pick up all of those vegetables and we feed those to our superworms. It's going to be a really, really big project to figure out the logistics, distribution, how different feed sources affect your insects, what types of things you can substitute. We're already thinking about this and feeling a little bit of the pain point. Our superworms consume this wheat byproduct, but wheat prices are expected to skyrocket this year due to poor weather in China and political conflict. So, it would be very helpful for us to have a comprehensive understanding of what types of byproducts we can feed to our worms when we can substitute things, because part of the nature of byproducts also is that it's very difficult to find very consistent ones that are available year round in consistent quantities. So it's definitely a very big R&D project for us now and in the future, and for our industry more broadly.
And we'll get into the academic support question a little bit. Now, I just hearing you speak, I recall another fun fact that you mentioned to me. And you said when you're cricket rearing, the little pinheads, which are the baby crickets, the one thing they love to do more than anything else is find a drop of water and drown in it. And I know when we talked to Allie about the black soldier fly larvae, she mentioned that they don't have mouths. I believe I've got that's right, and they absorb the food through their bodies. Are superworms different biologically? Do they have mouths? Do they consume through that? Do they drink water? They take it in from the ambient air? Talk about the species itself and just the rearing process.
Yeah, they definitely have mouths, and they will bite if they're hungry enough. It's very, very different in that regard. All insects, well, most insects absorb some moisture from the outside air. So that's why humidity levels are important in your environment. But our superworms and crickets also need external water sources to keep them properly hydrated. Yeah, they tend to, compared to black soldier fly larvae, they tend to prefer a drier environment. Black soldier fly larvae need very moist feed. And for the superworms, they live in a dry substrate and then have additional hydration sources added.
And we're talking about what comes in the front side of the bug, but what comes out the backside seems to be getting a lot of attention these days, especially with the shortage of inputs out there, and the fact that not only could this be a substitute for some of the fertilizers, it also checks the regenerative agriculture box. At least that's looks my perspective on that. Can you talk about the frass market and kind of where it was, where it is, and where you think it's going?
Yeah, absolutely. The frass is a really excellent product. It's a high quality organic fertilizer. And I am not a fertilizer expert, but a lot of people go crazy over this stuff. They say it's just really potent fertilizer. And there's a big problem with accessibility of fertilizer in the United States. It's going to be really important to keep fertilizer flowing to different parts of the states to make sure that we have enough for our fields. I actually can't speak too deeply on the frass market. It's not something that we have explored super in depth, but we generate a lot of it, and we have some folks that come and pick it up, and they love the stuff.
I mean, do you have excess? I mean, if there another market developed or another place to offload, would you entertain that, or do you have enough to?
Yeah, definitely. I'd say that our market and customers for frass is fairly underdeveloped. So we would love more sources and places where we could get rid of it. One interesting thing about frass that the research shows is that it can actually have positive effects on the immune system of plants, because the frass contains chitin, the insect exoskeletons. And apparently this chitin, when it comes in contact with the roots, the plant sometimes thinks it's under attack by insects. And so it promotes immune responses that make the plants healthier. I'm not a plant expert, but this is what some of the recent research has shown.
I mean, this feeds nicely into my next question. There's going to be a wide audience out there, obviously not on the call today, but your message will reach a lot of people. what is it that we can do to help you? What are some of the, near shore milestones, further away things, different markets? I know you'd mentioned that you'd love to have some additional academic resources to support some of the research, and we'll certainly help you out there. Talk a little about, if Trina had the magic wand and could cast 3 wishes, what would those look like?
If I could have the magic wand, I would have a phenomenal construction manager in Mississippi, or facility manager, I should say. And I would love to have some additional support on the real estate side. It's, as we think about expanding, we are trying to figure out what our next facility might look like, and thinking about all kinds of different variables, from logistics to opportunity zones to facilities that already exist. So we're very curious about folks that might have a lot more experience in agriculture, low-end commercial real estate, that kind of thing. In terms of academic partnerships and collaborations, or just folks that are interested in new research projects, I'd say that there's not enough academic support for our industry, right? The poultry industry, the other livestock has billions and billions of R&D budget behind it, and insects as a research topic is just getting started. So we need a lot more humans working on these problems. For example, there was a new superworm virus that was recently identified in the United States, and we just happened to find the person that identified it through a Facebook group on mealworm rearing that we happen to be on a particular thread. And it's one of those things where it's just this one person that knows about it, and we had been searching for over 2 years for this new superworm virus, because we've seen a lot of farms go down with it, right? It's been a problem for a couple of years now in the United States, and now I finally have this answer as of a few weeks ago, right? And so new diseases are going to pop up in this industry, and I don't think we have enough people working on those to help us identify it. So it's kind of this glaring gap that's a big threat to our industry that I don't think we're paying enough attention to. So there are a lot of really interesting research topics, and I mentioned the feed research as well. So I, encourage anyone that is working on these topics to get in touch with me, because I would love to know who you are and what you're working on. There's a lot to learn.
So great. And please, I want everyone to reach out to you, but let's take that one step further. Let's say somebody watches this and becomes so enthusiastic. And they just say, I'm just tired of what I'm doing in my life. I want to be like Trina. I want to go work for Trina. I mean, do you have any need for staff and employees outside of your real estate operations facility folks?
Yeah, we're looking for folks on the engineering side, folks on the operations side, more specifically physical operations, right? Someone that has experience setting up buildings and thinking through sites and that kind of thing. And then we also have need for farm workers, people that want to get their hands dirty and play with bugs. Yeah.
So can you describe what that would be like? I've certainly been to a mealworm factory before, but I've never been to a cricket factory. I'd imagine it's fairly, I've seen pictures, but can you just, when you walk through the door, what do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell? What's it like?
Well, it depends on if you're in the superworm buildings or the cricket buildings. In the cricket buildings, you'll hear chirping for sure. It's not as deafening as most people imagine it would be. It's kind of, it's soft, it's pleasant. It's definitely more intense than a summer night out on the porch, but it's, you can still talk over it. You see bins and bins and bins of crickets at different life stages. There's a lot of
How do you separate them from life stages? They know that it's time to go to the big boy bin or the big girl bin, or do you have to help them along the way?
Exactly. They get tired of sitting at the kids' table and they say, enough of this, I'm going to college. There's a lot of crying involved. It's sad and sweet. No, we hatch them every day. That's how you get them into separate sizes. We hatch them every day, and we have some that are 3 days old and some that are 30 days old. Right. And then it's an entire bin, or actually an entire room that's from the same week. And that's how you get them at different sizes.
That is amazing. And so they're born and they leave your factory. How long does that take for them to be packaged up for, whether it's your Chewy account or one of the other accounts to get to market?
Yeah, if we're harvesting them for powder, it's going to be about 5 weeks. We get diminishing returns on the feed conversion after about 5 weeks, because that's when they start turning into adults and they take some of their energy that would normally be spent growing their bodies, and they want to grow wings with that energy, right? So we want to harvest them before they grow wings. But if we're selling them into the exotic pet space, they are purchased at all different sizes, right? Because sometimes people are feeding little spiders, sometimes they're feeding little frogs, sometimes they're feeding big lizards. So they want all different sizes of these things. So we harvest 7 different sizes every day.
Oh my goodness. And then, okay, then we close the door there and we walk into the Superworm facility. And what's that smell or sound? Or I guess they don't really, I don't know. Do they make noises? What's that like?
You hear just like rustling, right? Especially if you've just given them some sort of hydration source. There's nothing like the sound of millions of superworms eating lettuce. It's just this really cool kind of crinkly, soft sound. It's lovely. You see lots and lots of bins, just aisles of bins. And you see all of these bins filled with material, the substrate that they live in with the superworms. So it's
And what kind of substrate do you use?
like
If you
I
can
said,
share.
we do have a proprietary feed that we use, but it's a lot of it is the byproduct from the flour milling process.
I'm sure they're very happy. I know when I had my mealworms that I was raising here at my house, they were the happiest little insects until the mice found them. And I didn't realize mice love mealworms so much, but they didn't miss any of them. They got them all.
Oh no, yeah, rodents love insects. Absolutely true.
So I know when I joined the Farm Credit, I was able to start using different euphemisms that related to agriculture. And I'm sure you've picked up quite a few of the bug related ones now that you use frequently and sprinkle them into your conversations. What are some of your favorite bug sayings?
Well, definitely talking about the gateway bug is crickets. Gosh, you know what? I think that we kind of avoid most of the puns because they're just so old and tired.
They are, aren't they?
Yeah,
You got
I
permission
think,
to use them.
yeah, I think we need more dad joke folks on our team to keep those puns alive, you know?
So Gwen, if you're listening out there, let's make sure that the social medias get a little bit of pun love with them. And then Trina, what question have I forgotten to ask you? I know you sent me about 40 of them over here, and I think I threw most of the softball. I'm kidding. But what else would you like to share with our audience here?
Gosh, I think you covered most of it. Do we have any questions from the few folks that are with us?
Yeah, feel free to chime in. Let your voice be heard. And if you do have a bearded dragon at home, make sure you go to Chewy and order the large banded crickets from Ovipost. And I think you have a couple different sizes in there as well.
I have a question, Evan.
Go ahead, Reed.
My question is, Trina, how can we as fellow entrepreneurs, potential consumers, maybe, how can we help you? What do you need?
Humans. we need employees in the Mississippi farm, and we need, as I mentioned, academic collaborators. I mean, I think when we launch our powder products, we would love some help getting the word out, and would love some, feedback on those products as they evolve. But we're probably a few months from launching those products at least. So at the moment, just trying to stay focused and make sure this Mississippi facility comes up at full scale and comes up properly. It's a very operationally complex business, which can make it a little bit difficult for folks without really deep insect knowledge to get into the nitty gritty and be helpful. But yeah, you can reach out to me. We can get you on our email list. And then as we have requests coming out, I'd love to get your help on this stuff.
Yeah, definitely do that. And just followed you on Twitter. Where are we going to see you in 5 years?
You're going to see, you're going to see more farms, big farms, many, many millions, billions of insects. You're going to see powder that's going into dog and cat food. You're going to see insect-based dog food on the shelves at all of your favorite pet stores. You're going to see our powder on Amazon and online for human consumption. And you're going to see our frass going to organic farms all across the country. We're pretty stoked. The industry is, as I mentioned, growing pretty fast. There's a ton of interest in it. Right now, the hardest part is not demand, but supply. So we just need to grow more bugs.
Wow, you heard it
Good
there
problem to
first.
have.
All my agricultural producers out there looking for another crop line or another species to raise, Trina's the person you want to contact. I mean, is that something that you would help out with if someone wanted to be a contract producer for you? Do you have the means to support and advise them?
We have not looked into contract producers, but I am always interested in talking to other bug farmers and other people that want to grow bugs. You know, it's a little bit of it's a close-knit community, and we like to help each other out and understand what other folks are working on. You know, we can't really afford to be siloed in the way that others might want to be, because there's just so much to learn, and the industry really benefits from having a lot of people working on these problems.
So when I met you a couple of years ago, Trina, if I remember correctly, you said that one of the opportunities you were looking forward was as fish food for farmed salmon, because there was a regulatory change coming that would force them to change their supply. What's the latest on that?
So yeah, our industry is looking into farmed salmon. So far, black soldier fly larvae meal has been approved as a feed source for salmon. And there is push to get additional species like our species approved for use in salmonid feed. So it's definitely an opportunity. However, we need to be at massive scale in order to serve that industry. So it's a little bit further out than the pet food industry. With the pet food industry, you can find folks that are creating smaller batches, but with salmonid feed, you really need to have many, many very large facilities and prove that you are generating many, many tons, because it is, it's a fairly large project for a salmon farm to test and approve a new feed. It's just a longer process. It's a very big market opportunity, and it's a longer process. So I do see that in queue, but it makes sense for our first market to be more on that pet food side.
Got it. Thank you for that. Great to hear your update.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's exciting. Now you can see why I've always been a fan of Trina's. You know, she knows her science, and I'm a geek for science, and she isn't afraid to share her knowledge on stage. So Trina, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, well, I'm going to hit the pause